All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This will be recorded and it will be up on our website probably around Tuesday after we do final edits, and you will be able to view it. I will post it on social media. Um, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Tracy Slepcevic. I am the president and founder of Autism Health. We are a 501(c)(3) nonprofit organization dedicated to funding scholarships and providing resources for families such as this one who are affected by autism spectrum disorder. So a little bit about us and our mission. We're dedicated to advancing scientific research and improving health and quality of the life of individuals with autism by addressing those underlying conditions associated with what's going on with the body and the brain. Um, our mission is to fund groundbreaking research, advance education, foster multidisciplinary collaboration, and expand access to trusted resources that empower families, caregivers, and professionals to make informed decisions regarding comprehensive, individualized care by translating scientific discovery into practical application, engaging community leaders, and strengthening systems of care for individuals, families, and communities impacted by autism. So, just a few upcoming events that I just wanted to real quick go through. If you are local to Southern California, we are doing a Cocktails for a Cause event. And this is sponsored by Cellular Performance Institute. We've partnered with CPI in doing a clinical trial for autism for mesenchymal stem cells. So they'll be talking a little bit about that there. And the tickets are $85. You can go on our website under events at autismhealth.com, or you can scan the QR code and purchase a ticket. Current speakers are Dr. Sabine Hazan and the doctors who will be heading up the clinical trial. We are also doing our first winter gala in Jupiter, Florida. I'm really excited about this. Currently, headline speakers are Del Bigtree, General Michael Flynn, who has a grandson with autism, and several doctors who will be speaking. And I have submitted a request for Kennedy to speak, so we'll see. And we do have our Autism Health Summit conference. Now, if you purchase a ticket, early before the end of August, you can get 50% off your ticket. That doesn't even cover the cost of your food. So you can go onto our website and go under events again and go to the Autism Health Summit and early registration. If you use code AHS50, you can get 50% off, or you can scan the QR code. It's not going to be available after that, and it is not going to come back after that. This is for early registration only. It is April 29th through May 1st. It's a 3-day conference. Dr. Woeller will be one of our speakers. So we'll have some pretty amazing speakers. And you know, as usual, Del Bigtree will be headlining and some others. We're doing a little fundraiser over the summer. And if you scan the QR code, you can purchase a ticket bundle, and 1/3 of that cost, which is $30 for 2 tickets, goes to Autism Health. And the reason why I chose this fundraiser is because Regal provides sensory-friendly screening nights. So for kids who struggle with sitting in a movie theater, want to run around, you know, it's a free for all, and I really like that about Regal. So we are, if you scan the QR code and you purchase a bundle, then 1/3 of that cost will go to Autism Health. So at Autism Health, we feel like your comments matter to us. We want to get your feedback and testimonials if you've gone to a conference, if you have an experience of learning from our webinars, going to or attending our autism support groups. We ask for your feedback and we ask for your testimonials, and you can email that to info@autismhealth.com. And if you scan the QR code, you can see some of our testimonials online. So we want to thank you. We are a 501(c)(3), so if you feel compelled to donate, we would be super grateful. We survive on donations, and we are able to do programs like this when you donate, even if it's just a small $10, $25 a month. A recurring donation makes a huge difference. They do all add up. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. He's going to be talking about methylcobalamin therapy, also known as methylated B12. Dr. Woeller is a doctor of osteopathic medicine, integrative and functional medicine physician, and biomedical autism treatment specialist in clinical practice for nearly 3 decades. He's part of the old guard. Dr. Woeller is also the Chief Medical Officer for Mosaic Diagnostic Laboratory and the Educational Director and main course developer for his Integrative Medicine Academy, an online academy for health professionals. His private practice, Sunrise Functional Medicine, focuses on specialized laboratory testing and interventions for individuals with complex health disorders such as autism and other special needs conditions, autoimmune, gastrointestinal, and neurological issues, as well as chronic health conditions associated with environmental exposure, including mold and mycotoxins. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Woeller. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Tracy. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me share my screen and make sure it all comes up. So you should see it in full view. Okay. Tracy, also, I hope that the Zoom mute works for the dogs. You mentioned you have dogs barking. My 2 dogs were just barking as
Oh, I
well.
didn't hear anything.
Well, I had my microphone
Oh,
muted. That's why I muted my camera, because I just went outside and said, "Hey," because but we're all good. So I'm happy to be here, everybody. By the way, my glasses are computer glasses, so I need to wear them so I can see. So but I know I'm a little screen up at the top of the screen. But what I wanted to do is, Tracy had asked me to give a presentation for this webinar series, and I had created a lecture in the past, probably back in April, for the Autism Health Summit, just in reserve in case I was needed to sort of step on stage. I wasn't. It was a fantastic conference. I recommend everybody attend. But this actual presentation, although I've adapted a little bit, added some slides, was similar to a presentation that I gave at MAPS back in March in Charlotte. And the idea behind this was I wanted to talk about some therapies that have existed for a long time, including specifically methylcobalamin, but have somewhat been forgotten about or overlooked. We're now kind of in a cycle, and it's legitimate, using things like leucovorin, for example. And I'll mention some things about leucovorin. We'll have a Q&A at the end that you can ask as well. And it's an important treatment. But I wanted to kind of go back in time and sort of give some context as to what the research has showed in years past to even bring us up to the point of discussion with regards to leucovorin, and why methylcobalamin is one of those things that should not be overlooked. So the disclaimer here, this is for educational purposes only. We're not getting into specific treatments for your particular child. So that all comes down to working with your individual physician. So years ago, I've been in practice for nearly 30 years. I actually got my start in San Diego, which is originally where I'm from. And when I first started working with parents and their children on the autism spectrum, I started to realize over time that many of the foundational things that we were doing and were doing at that point were very helpful. And that if some of these foundational things weren't done, often the kids did not really get better. And I developed something called the four pillar approach, which is sort of conceptually how I approach things from a biomedical standpoint. Understanding that fundamentally diet and having a healthy diet, real food, whole food diet is critically important. Also, avoiding certain things in the diet that tend to be toxic, artificial flavoring and coloring, for example. And so, no matter what we're doing, whether it's methyl B12, whether it's leucovorin, whether it's nystatin or something else, foundationally, these principles should be in place and really, as best as possible, sort of followed over time. So, dietary intervention is key, but we also realize that many kids on the autism spectrum, that would be teenagers and adults as well, often have a limited diet. So they either have poor absorption of nutrients, or they're limited by choice or texture issues or sensory issues. And this has been well researched. If you look at the work of Jim Adams out of Arizona State, Julie Matthews as well, they've done studies that actually have documented that many individuals with autism are often nutrient depleted in certain things. And so foundational supplements comes into play, not to overcome or sort of override a diet, but to complement a healthy diet, to fill in those gaps nutritionally. And so I'm a big believer in that. And then, of course, digestive system problems, that's a huge topic. And then finally, sort of to round out the four pillars, is this concept of methylation. We're going to talk about what methylation is. And fundamentally, when we are working on diet and using foundational supplements and working on gut function and reducing toxins, we're automatically going to support the methylation cycle. And you can't support the methylation cycle and not also influence what's called the folate cycle. And so the methylation cycle, this thing that we've been talking about for years, is really, really important and really central to the discussion of autism, particularly from a biomedical standpoint. But it doesn't live in isolation. So it has a relationship to the folate cycle and these other types of cycles. A lot of times people will really focus on MTHFR as a sort of all-determining enzyme reaction. And it is important because it is intimately involved in helping to produce something called active folate, what we also call methylfolate. But there are other enzyme systems within these cycles that often are important. I'm going to point one out specifically that often gets overlooked, but that particular enzyme we're going to mention is very sensitive to various toxins. So what is methylation? Well, a methyl group is a carbon and three hydrogen atoms, attached. And this methyl group gets transferred from one chemical to another with the idea, at least biochemically, to have some sort of modifying influence. That might be to turn on a chemical reaction. In other cases, it might be to turn off a chemical reaction. This thing happens in neurotransmitter function or production, happens in the mitochondria. And a good example of methylation is our genetics. So our DNA gets methylated. And essentially, what that means is that certain nucleotides get a methyl group attached to it to essentially regulate its activity. And the overall premise here is that we methylate our DNA so that our DNA isn't constantly open to being transcribed. We don't want that to be happening all the time because that can lead to too much production and that could certainly lead to problems as well. So it has a regulatory influence. And why is methylation so important? Well, it really has to do with the fact that when you actually look biochemically at what's happening with most individuals with autism, and this is not just strictly to autism, this pattern exists in people with Alzheimer's and other types of neurodevelopmental and neurological conditions. But a methylation impairment can be linked to poor language development, poor cognition, diminished environmental awareness, multiple neurochemical imbalances. It even can disrupt the immune system. It can disrupt mitochondrial function. It can compromise detoxification. And one of the trailblazers in methylation or methyl B12 therapy, particularly in the subcutaneous form of this therapy, was Dr. James Newbrander. He's pretty much retired these days, but he's really considered to be the father of methylcobalamin subcutaneous injection therapy. And I learned a lot from him. I followed his protocols for years. I still today feel that the methyl B12 subcutaneous injection is really the gold standard way of implementing methyl B12, although I completely understand and acknowledge that it's not doable for everybody and we need other options. We'll talk about some of those options. But before getting there, I just wanted to kind of remind everybody, if you've been around for a while in this autism space, or if you're new, to realize that there have been many established, what I consider to be innovative options for years. Vitamin B6 and magnesium doesn't sound real fancy, but it's been around for a long time and can be very helpful. The gluten casein-free diet, foundational nutrients, as I just mentioned, all have their place in this biomedical arena of treatment, hyperbaric oxygen treatment, antifungal treatment, which is something that I still feel is extremely helpful for many individuals with autism when there is an underlying fungal problem. And there are certainly many more. I'm really big in my practice in providing parents with homework. What that means is reading material or video material to watch. And this is actually a very good document. It came back out in 2013, but the information is still relevant. You can actually go to the Autism Research Institute website and download a copy. And this actually came from Dr. James Adams. So it's about a 25-page document on different types of nutrients. And in this particular one, I just took some screen captures, was specifically talking about vitamin B6. And we've known for years that many individuals with autism are often deficient in B6. Now, whether it's because they have an absorption problem or just aren't getting enough of it in their diet is, probably a mixture of both. But this was a particular article that talked about just of parents rating B6 compared to risperidol, for example, specifically with regards to behaviors. And, it wasn't perfect, but it had about a 50% positivity rate of having made a difference of a simple vitamin in combination with a mineral that you can get at most health food stores. And in the world that I live, because I like to understand mechanisms, I want to try to understand why something is necessary or why it's doing what it's doing. And what's amazing about B6 is there's over 1,100 enzymatic reactions in our body that are dependent on B6. And what that says to me is that B6 is under a lot of pressure, meaning we have to have a good, decent, continual supply of it to support these enzymatic reactions that our body is constantly demanding. That could be for the formation of glutathione, that could be for supporting neurotransmitter production, etc. Now, the magnesium component of this discussion is really applied to try to offset some of the possible hyperactivity reactions that can happen with B6. But that's not unique to B6 because that can happen with B12, that can happen with folate, that can happen with B1, B2. So the hyperactivity aspect is something that is relatively common and almost expected to occur at least for a short period of time. So I said homework, right? There's a lot of books out there. These are a couple of my favorite from years past. I think these are books that all of you should have in your library. By the way, I was mentioning to Tracy prior to this starting, I don't always know entirely what the audience is made up. A lot of the lectures I give are usually a combination of parents and healthcare practitioners. So this particular lecture is really kind of speaking to, both groups essentially. But even if you don't have medical training or scientific training, that's fine. These books are really good from a research reference standpoint. So it's been around for a while. Autism Effective Biomedical Treatments. Dr. Pangborn was one of the early pioneers in the Defeat Autism Now organization, what was called DAN. DAN eventually became MAPS. And then Dr. Sidney Baker is a long-term integrated medicine practitioner. So you can find this, online as well. And then these two books are also very, very fundamental. So one of the first books that I read many years ago with regards to the complexities of Autism and Fungal Infections was this book on the left-hand side, Biological Treatments for Autism and PDD. There was actually an earlier version. I think I probably had the first or second edition. And then I actually submitted a chapter for the second book on the right. And both of these books were authored in part by Dr. Bill Shaw. And Dr. Bill Shaw is who founded Great Plains Laboratory. So Great Plains Laboratory was started in 1995. I was first introduced to them 1998 or so after I had attended my first autism conference in San Diego. And they're most known for the organic acids test, which is something I've been involved in with regards to educational development now for many, many years. So um, the lab is now called Mosaic Diagnostics. Great Plains sold it about 4 years ago. And then I came on as the chief medical officer at Mosaic last August. So I've been involved in test development and furthering the educational aspects of the lab. But as we bring it back now to the main point of this conversation, the core problem that is happening in autism with regards to the methylation cycle is multifactorial. One is that the enzyme called methionine synthase, which often gets overlooked, is an enzyme that is very sensitive to environmental exposures. That could be metals, that could be chemicals, that could be mycotoxins. Anything that drives oxidative stress will impair or can impair methionine synthase activity. And it's the methionine synthase that actually combines the methylation cycle and the folate cycle. So the folate cycle is on the left, the methylation cycle in the middle, and then we have something called the transsulfuration pathway, which comes down off of homocysteine. If you actually look at this image, think of homocysteine and the methionine, the methylation cycle, like a clock face. Homocysteine sits at 6 o'clock, methionine sits at 12 o'clock on the clock face. And so it's constantly spinning around, producing these different chemicals. But it's the relationship between the folate cycle and the methylation cycle that's really important, because both of those things in unison also support what's called transsulfuration, which is about producing glutathione and other detoxification compounds that are important to get rid of toxins in our body. By the way, the use of leucovorin or folinic acid obviously fits into the methylation cycle. And that's an important treatment. But it's important to understand that leucovorin and methyl-B12 complement each other. Oftentimes, you don't get positive response, or at least the positive response that you're hoping for with leucovorin, until you actually add in methyl-B12. That doesn't mean that happens or is needed in every single case. Every child is a little bit different. But again, these systems don't work in isolation. They're always having some type of overlapping and complementary influence. So what's the research that looks at methylation? Well, it actually goes back to a very seminal paper that came out in 2004 in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And this is what's called the Jill James paper. And there was a number of authors on that particular paper. But the point of this paper is it documented the increased impaired methylation problem in autism, as well as oxidative stress. And what they did is they looked at a number of different biomarkers, from methionine to homocysteine to glutathione, etc. And consistently across the board, what they found was that there was impaired methylation biomarkers and increases of inactive glutathione that were consistent with impaired methylation capacity and oxidative stress. And when they implemented folinic acid, betaine, which is trimethylglycine, and methylcobalamin, there was a dramatic improvement in the metabolic imbalance. So the study actually had 53 children in all, 20 with autism. Average age was 7. Of the 20 kids with autism, 19 were diagnosed regressive, and then 1 was diagnosed infantile autism. Now they picked 8 for the specific criteria. They picked 8 to receive supplementation. And for the first 90 days, they gave folinic acid low dose, 800 micrograms twice a day, and betaine, 1,000 milligrams twice a day. and they watched what happened. They were basically monitoring the biomarkers, but it wasn't until they actually added in methylcobalamin as a subcutaneous injection did they start to see a dramatic change in a few aspects of the methylation transsulfuration pathway, and that was specifically in the increase of active glutathione. And what's fascinating about that is the use of methylcobalamin was causing a positive increase in active glutathione, which we need to protect the mechanisms of methylation and folate cycle, our mitochondria detoxification. But it was doing it somewhat indirectly because glutathione wasn't actually being used. It was the methyl B12 that was doing it. Now, there are many ways of giving methylcobalamin. This was a paper that came out in 2021 by Dr. Rosignol, Dr. Fry. This is a review paper that was looking at different studies and different methods of methyl B12 and oral, etc. And again, what they found was that there was really good evidence that the injected form of methyl B12 was extremely helpful, particularly for these kids who had what they called unfavorable biomarkers. Basically, that meant they had significant impairment in methylation and oxidative stress. So the methylation and folate cycle complement each other. And the discussion or conversation needs to move beyond just MTHFR. And I'm not downplaying MTHFR. MTHFR is very important, but it's only one enzyme in a series of biochemical pathways that are needed to be working functionally. And so I want to talk a little bit about methionine synthase because I've seen for years that this particular enzyme gets overlooked in most medical journal articles that are talking about autism intervention with regards to methylation problems in many conferences, etc. And one of the doctors that's been around for years that has done a tremendous amount of research into methionine synthase as well as methyl B12 is Dr. Richard Deeth. He's a PhD, I want to say originally from Columbia, but I might be mistaken. I think he's now in Florida. But what he's shown is that methionine synthase is very vulnerable. One of the early papers that Dr. Deeth did was look at the effect of ethanol, arsenic, lead, mercury, aluminum, and the vaccine preservative at that time, which was thimerosal. Now, most thimerosal has been removed from the vaccines. I think some of the flu shots still might contain a little bit, but they still contain aluminum. And so these heavy metals can negatively affect methionine synthase. That enzyme is what's needed to convert homocysteine to methionine. It's also needed to help allow the folate cycle to go through its complete cycle, essentially. And again, what they have found and what his studies also have found in collaboration with that Jill James study was that there is impaired methylation and increased oxidative stress because of these environmental exposures. But the key point is that if our methionine synthase is compromised, we may not get good effect with leucovorin. We may not necessarily even get good effect with methyl B12 or B6 or some of these other complementary supplements that we often used. And I won't go through all the mechanisms of why methionine synthase gets basically screwed up, but essentially it comes down to things that just disrupt the normal function and relationship of its internal chemistry. And one of those things that we always have to pay attention to when we have a child that's not necessarily responding to a treatment, although we think they should, we can't know everything, is to pull the lens back and say, what else might be going on? What else might be interfering? And we know that environmental exposures in many autistic individuals often have certain genetic variants that affect the way that they detoxify chemicals. And so environmental exposures play a big role in that. So let's just talk about that for a second here. Heavy metals and the discussion of heavy metals has been around for a long, long time. My first Defeat Autism Now conference was in 1997, 1998. Even though I don't remember that particular conference, if heavy metals were discussed. They probably were. I just don't remember. But it wasn't that long after that I started attending um, conferences where heavy metals and mercury exposure were being discussed. In fact, Jerry Cartsenell was one of the first Dan doctors that I met at that time. Talked to him about, the negative impact of metals, particularly mercury. So we know that metals are things that we're all exposed to, unfortunately. Aluminum is a major problem in our world. Certainly lead, cadmium, and mercury and arsenic are not benign. And the bottom line is what happens in the presence of heavy metals is they disrupt what is called sulfur chemistry because they're like heat-seeking missiles to sulfur compounds in our body. And that's problematic because we have a lot of sulfur compounds in our brain and nervous system. And so one of the things that we need a lot of to help neutralize against heavy metals is glutathione. So, but in the presence of metals, glutathione and other supporting type of sulfur compounds, like cysteine, for example, etc., they all contain these sulfur groups, what's called a thiol. And so, even though they may help neutralize metals to some degree, if it's a continual problem, or we have problems in making glutathione because of some intrinsic impairment in the methylation cycle, well, the balance gets tipped to more toxicity. One of the tests I always like to start with in clinical practice, although it's not the only way of assessing for heavy metal exposure, is a hair test. It's pretty easy to get, gives a snapshot of exposure, helps to kind of open up the discussion if we need to look further to just appreciate the negative influence of metals. Now, environmental chemicals are a problem too. So Mosaic actually has something called a tox detect profile that looks at a wide variety of chemicals. I just picked this one, benzene. This is something, unfortunately, we're all exposed to or can be, depending on your exposure source, but just driving in motor vehicles, for example, we get exposed to some benzene. It's found in paints and plastic, rubber, tobacco smoke. I've actually had a couple families where we did a tox detect, found very high levels of benzene, and it turned out it was occurring from a family member who was smoking. So, in the home, actually. And why I'm bringing up benzene, for example, is that these things have unique toxicity that can impair the methylation cycle. So, not to get too deep in the weeds from a chemical standpoint, but benzene, particularly the lower right image you see, benzene oxide. What's unique about some of these benzene derivatives is they contain a group, a chemical configuration called an epoxide. And you can see here there's all different types of benzene types of compounds. But that epoxide group, that triangular group that's attached, that looks like it's, this thing's attached to that oxygen atom, are highly reactive. And what makes epoxides so toxic is they are very reactive biologically, and they can damage our DNA, and they can increase oxidative stress. And they can also zap our reserves of antioxidants, particularly glutathione and other what are called thiol types of compounds. And so this is a problem. We can't avoid these things 100%. But if we have methylation impairment and we have transsulfuration impairment, well, we're going to become more vulnerable. In fact, if you barbecue, for example, just barbecuing meat can increase the exposure to certain types of benzene compounds. So 3,4-benzpyrene, for example, is something that occurs or can occur through charcoal broiled foods or cigarette smoke or diesel exhaust. The bottom line is what happens, interestingly enough, is as our body tries to metabolize this particular compound, it actually turns it into a toxic epoxide. And in this particular case, the epoxide attacks our DNA. So it actually will mess with certain nucleotides, guanine and cytosine in our DNA. Now, remember, I mentioned up front that methylation helps to protect some of those nucleotides of our DNA. We also need methylation to help detoxify things in our liver, and we also need methylation to support glutathione production. So all of these things tend to work in unison. Again, we can't live in a perfect world. None of us live in a bubble. We're all going to have some exposures, but it's about optimizing our potential nutritionally and biochemically so that when we do have these exposures, we're not so negatively impacted by them. Another example of toxins are mycotoxins. So the mycotox profile from Mosaic Diagnostics measures a number of different medically significant mycotoxins. A very interesting group of mycotoxins is called trichothecenes. And this comes from a wide variety of molds. So Fusarium mold, for example, and probably the most um, concerning mold is what's called Stachybotrys. Fortunately, it's not real common unless you have some significant water damage in the home. But all of these particular molds produce these trichothecenes. And why is that problematic? Well, you'll recognize where the red circles are hitting, that little functional group is an epoxide, that same epoxide that's found on benzene, for example, and other chemicals. And that same epoxide that can rob the body of glutathione and these other thiol types of compounds. And so the presence of these will not only stress the detoxification glutathione system, it will stress the transsulfuration, methylation, and probably somewhat indirectly the folate system as well. So one of the things that I do in my practice and advocate other practitioners, if there's practitioners listening to this presentation, is to always consider looking at these tests. I always start with the organic acid test in my practice. It's a go-to test for me. But we can think of mycotoxins and environmental toxins and metal toxins as also being assessments to evaluate for exposure. And in this particular context, things that could be negatively affecting the methylation cycle. So let's think about some methyl B12 therapy. There are a wide variety of ways of giving methyl B12. You can do it through a capsule, you can do liposomal liquid, you could do transdermal applications. I want to focus on two common ways. What I call the regular liquid, which could be converted into a nasal spray, and then a subcutaneous injection, which is where we'll spend most of our time. Now, clinically, when I'm in practice, there's always I take all of this into consideration when I'm thinking of any type of supplement, including methyl B12. The same thing's true of leucovorin, for example. In this particular case, what other supplements is the child taking that might already contain methyl B12? What is their individual sensitivity to supplements in general? They're all unique, right? They all have individual sensitivity to things, so that always has to come into play. There's no one size fits all for everybody. Do we know any genetic influences if we've done any kind of testings that might play a determining factor? And then just their ability to take supplements. We know some kids, it's extremely challenging. And then, but one thing I just want to say is that in general, in practice, what I've seen, and this goes back to the many thousands of patients that even Dr. Newbrander saw, is that the clinical results observed for methyl B12 are often judged against the subcutaneous injection form. Again, that's not to imply that some other forms aren't effective, but really the amount of research and time and clinical experience over the decades has really shown that if possible, the subcutaneous injection would be the optimal way of giving it if doable. Again, there are other studies that have been out there that have shown benefit with things like oral as well. So I don't want to paint a picture that there's only one way, but just kind of understand that the methyl B12 form is really, again, really kind of considered to be the gold standard. This was an interesting paper, 2022, that looked at just straight up oral methyl B12. It's a 500 microgram per teaspoon dosing. They did this study for 200 days. And the biggest take home from this particular paper, the biggest area of impact was improvement in socialization, interestingly enough. So most of these studies with methyl B12, the same is true with leucovorin. You get improvements in communication, improvements in behavior, improvements in cognitive ability. But this particular one, for whatever reason, what they found was that there was just more improvement in social engagement. Now, I've used this form quite a lot over the years. New Beginnings Nutritionals is a supplement company, carry a lot of high-end good products. Methylmate is their oral form of methyl B12. The cool thing about this is when you actually order Methylmate, they will send a nasal applicator. So you take off the dropper cap, you replace it with a nasal applicator, and your Methylmate just turned into a nasal spray. So it's difficult. I often get asked, well, what's the dose? The reality is there isn't one dose. It's a bit of a spectrum when you're using something like nasal spray. In general, for most kids, I would start with one spray each nostril daily, maybe have a range of anywhere between 1 to 2 sprays per nostril each daily. Challenging, yes, particularly in younger kids. Not a lot of little kids don't like to have a nasal spray up their nose, so it can be challenging in that regards. The other thing about the nasal spray is that it's generally more quickly metabolized, which means you have to typically do the dosing, once or twice a day, every day. Whereas with the subcutaneous injections, it's usually initiated, at least to start, every 3 days. And it's because the way it's applied in the form tends to last longer in the body. It's not so quickly metabolized. So, by the way, I'll give you the website for New Beginnings Nutritionals. If you're not familiar with them, I would strongly recommend reaching out to them. You can talk to Lori Knowles, who runs the company. She is a mother of a child with autism who's now recovered, lost his diagnosis, graduated college, and is off living independently. So, methyl B12, the subcutaneous injections. I'm not going to go through all the parameters of dosing. That is really more for practitioners, who may be listening. Remember, this lecture was adopted from what I presented at the MOUTS conference. But the bottom line is this. These injections come in pre-filled insulin syringes. So the needle is very, very small. The principle behind the subcutaneous injection is that when you inject subcutaneous injection, it stays in the subcutaneous tissue, crystallizes there, and is slowly released into the bloodstream so that you get a consistent level over time. That's why it's only done, at least initially, every 72 hours. Now, my personal preference as far as a pharmacy that I like to use is Hopewell Pharmacy. I have used others, but based on the work of Jim Newbrander and now some of the chemical work from Dr. Deeth, there's something about the Hopewell version of methyl B12 that seems to have some other additive influence, probably from an antioxidant standpoint. That's not to say that other pharmacies don't make good methyl B12. It's just that in the autism world, that additional aspect of that antioxidant capacity of the Hopewell version, perhaps it's the pH and how they make it, just seems to have that added benefit. So that's my personal preference and has been so for years. So the key is where you inject. So the idea is this is injected in the upper outer quadrant of the buttocks. It doesn't matter right or left. It can be done at any time of the day. You as a parent have to be comfortable doing it. And there's many thousands of parents over the years that have become comfortable in administering a methyl B12 injection. It's implemented at about a 30-degree angle or less. You're not going straight in. You're actually going at an angle because we want the methyl B12 to accumulate underneath the subcutaneous tissue so it forms a little bolus and then is slowly released into the bloodstream. Numbing cream can be used. Most of the time, it's not necessary. Again, this can be done any time of the day. What I recommend when you are doing methyl B12, whatever time of the day you do it, is just be consistent with that time. So if it's 2 in the afternoon, just make it 2 in the afternoon every 72 hours. If it's 2 in the morning, if that's easier, then just make it that. So it's, again, we're looking for consistency over time. The general observations of methyl B12 over the years have been, in general, about 70% of parents report positive changes that are noticeable in the first 6 weeks. Improve eye contact, awareness, more social engagement, increased attention, increased focusing abilities. If you go back through so many of the studies that I have referenced, those same things apply. In fact, that one study I mentioned where they used oral B12, it was the socialization component that was most prevalent. By the way, this same thing applies to leucovorin. It's known that about 70% of the kids some type of positive response to leucovorin. So about 20% of parents don't recognize any noticeable changes in the first 6 weeks. That doesn't mean there aren't changes happening. They're just not necessarily recognizable. And admittingly, a lot of times with these therapies, and the same is true right now with leucovorin, is what gets spun on social media is that, these are remedies that are automatically going to help language or that, automatically help a child to speak. Excuse me. And that's not necessarily the case. Those may be things that we want to see and hope for, but we may get something entirely different. We might hope that the child is going to speak, but instead they're more social, or they have increased attention, or they may sleep better, or they're just less agitated. We just don't always know. The body is going to do what it's going to do, and the brain is going to do what it's going to do based on prioritization and abilities. Now, less than 10% of parents will see no benefit, and around 5% or so, maybe 5 to 10, it's not that high, will sometimes see intolerable side effects. I'll talk about what I consider to be intolerable side effects here shortly. Now, ideally, when methyl B12 as a subcutaneous injection is being implemented, it's best to not add any new therapies at the same time. And I also feel don't change any therapies that the child is already on. So we're just basically starting methyl B12 and seeing what we get. So we get a true observation of its influence. I'll take it back to leucovorin. You can make the same, argument for leucovorin. You shouldn't start leucovorin and 5 other supplements. I wouldn't stop 5 supplements the child's on and then the next day start leucovorin, because if there's a problem, you don't know what is causing it. You're trying to isolate it down for at least a short period of time to be able to get a true read on its effectiveness. Understanding that these treatments often aren't just done for 6 weeks. These are done for months, in some cases, a number of years. I mean, the literature on leucovorin is that this is something that is done for an extended period of time. The same thing can be true of methyl B12. Yeah, there are some side effects. Hyperactivity is fairly common, be 40, 60, 50%. It's usually not excessive, usually dies down in a few weeks. A little bit disruptive, but to be expected. Sleeping disturbance may occur, although I've had kids sleep through the night on methyl B12, so you don't always know what you're going to get. Mouthing of objects is fairly common. They just become more mouthy. I'm not seeing the mouthy component so much with leucovorin, interestingly enough. Definitely see it with the methyl B12. So expect this going in, and this is true honestly, this is true of methyl B12, it's true of B6, it's true of leucovorin. Kind of expect to maybe see the hyperactivity, and if it doesn't happen, great. That doesn't mean it's not working, you're just not getting that reaction. There's always this positive negative scenario with these types of remedies. In my experience, aggressive and self-injurious behavior is not a tolerable side effect. It's a concern, and in those particular cases, I will take the child off and try to figure out what's happening. Same thing is true of leucovorin, honestly. I don't, again, the aggressiveness and the self-injurious is not like, well, maybe that's working. That's not the case. We've got a child that is dysregulated. They're agitated. We need to try our best to figure it out, because that's not a long-term solution. Now, a very common, interesting scenario that I've seen over the years with B12, starting to see it to some degree with leucovorin, but the track record of using methyl B12 goes back many, many years. And this is where a parent will say, well, my child seems more easily frustrated and agitated since starting methyl B12, so therefore they're having a negative reaction. Well, when you actually look, you think the child is more easily frustrated in doing tasks that they commonly did not attempt prior to starting methyl B12. So what's happened is the B12 has sort of kicked in this impulse for the child to actually become more engaged, which is a positive thing. And then the parents report the child is agitated and more easily upset, but that likely is occurring because you now have a child that's more willing to engage, has the drive to become engaged, but because they are lacking certain ability, they now become more easily frustrated. And to me, that is a natural human reaction. That's not an abnormal reaction or a side effect. We just kind of have to let the child sort of work things through and try to readjust. To me, this is actually a positive scenario, albeit a little uncomfortable for sure. But if you understand in the context of these discussions, and the same thing could be applied to leucovorin, um, if we sort of ride it out over time, they will start to reach a new plateau. So as we kind of close this up, one thing to always keep in mind is that, again, these interventions do not work in isolation. You can't drop in leucovorin and expect it to not have some other influence on these interrelated chemical systems. The same thing with methyl-B12, the same thing with B6, etc. But if for the most part, if we have, implemented some of those early pillars, we're working on diet as best as possible. I understand that's kind of an evolving process. And we've got some foundational nutrients in play to kind of create some backdrop chemistry of support. And have worked or are working on gut function, whether it's bacterial imbalances or fungal issues, etc. If all that stuff is sort of in the background, kind of ongoing, and we start working on methylation or folate support, and we're not getting the response that we hope for, maybe expect. Okay, I don't necessarily expect every child to have the exact same response. But let's say we're not the needle is not moving at all. Then we have to start thinking what else may be interfering here? Where else could we look? And that's where you bring in the discussion of other environmental toxins, whether that's metals, whether that's environmental chemicals, whether that's mycotoxins. And I learned this early on because even as a doctor early on, I had my expectations that because I had seen success before, that I expected that success to continue until I started seeing some kids that didn't respond, and I was not sure why. I actually had a couple situations in my practice where the fungus infections, candida overgrowth, was the major interfering aspect on the methylation response of methyl B12. And I wasn't exactly sure why. And I think I figured it out. One of the things that candida and many of these yeasts produce after they're metabolizing sugar is they produce a chemical compound called acetaldehyde. Now, we're all familiar with acetaldehyde if you've ever had an alcoholic drink, whether it's hard alcohol, beer, or wine. Our body will turn ethanol into acetaldehyde before it becomes acetic acid. And it's high levels of acetaldehyde that are often attributable to the hangover effects of alcohol. Certainly, ethanol has its influence too. Well, it turns out that acetaldehyde, as a byproduct of fungal metabolism, is a direct inhibitor of methionine synthase. So, and that's one of the negative aspects, by the way, of too much alcohol consumption, is that it interferes with methylation, which then indirectly interferes with transsulfuration, which then interferes with glutathione. So again, we pull the lens back to say what else may be happening. And that's what we do in clinical practice, but it's something that you can think about as a parent for your own child. And if there's a practitioner thinking, watching this presentation, think about that as well. So I have a couple of website resources. This particular website, it used to be called Autism Action Plan. The name was changed a number of years ago to Autism Recovery System. This is a membership support site for parents and caregivers with kids on the autism spectrum. Actually, as membership into this site, you can get a copy of my book called The Benefits of Methyl B12. And it goes through much of what I talked about in much more detail. A really cool part of this website is I have an entire course on the fundamental aspects of biomedical intervention. So it's 6 modules. It's called Autism Biomed Essentials. It's about 8, 9 hours of lecture material. That's all included in the membership fee. And then you can also post questions to me too on an ongoing basis through the forum. Some general recommendations, and again, this is really for a mixed crowd, this particular slide, um, because this lecture actually came from a presentation I was giving to healthcare practitioners mostly. So if you are a healthcare practitioner and you have the ability to order lab testing, I would strongly recommend you contact Mosaic Diagnostics and set up an account. And that would give you access to the organic acid test, the Toxitect, the mycotox, metal testing. If you're a practitioner or a parent, you can create a relationship with New Beginnings Nutritionals. Lori Knowles is the individual who runs New Beginnings Nutritionals. There's her email. You're welcome to email her and said, I saw Dr. Woeller on Saturday give a presentation for Autism Health. He mentioned your company. I want to learn more. And so they have a lot of great products. I use them a lot in my practice. There's the contact information for Hopewell Pharmacy. So obviously it requires a prescription from Hopewell to get Methyl-B12. So if you're a practitioner, that's valuable. And then all of you can actually join my Substack. So I actually have a Substack, drwoeller.substack.com. I have a lot of articles on there. I try to post once a week if I can. It gets a little challenging sometimes with my schedule. Um, I mostly post about, autism related or other types of laboratory testing. But I have other articles that I write as well. And then if you are a healthcare practitioner, there's also my Integrative Medicine Academy. So Integrative Medicine Academy is an online academy. Tracy had mentioned it up front. It's been around for, I don't know, 10 years maybe. So my first course that I developed was something called Autism Mastery Course. And we have 9 courses as part of Integrated Medicine Academy. They're all very in-depth, probably a total of about 230 hours of lecture material. We have individual courses, and then the Autism Mastery course is a 16 module course. It's a long course, about 35 plus hours of lecture material, but it is foundational with regards to the biomedical aspects of biomedical intervention. And it is geared towards healthcare practitioners as far as, the language and the concepts and the biochemistry. If you are a parent and as well as a practitioner, you're certainly willing to take it. If you're a parent that, has been doing this for a while or wants access to it, then I'm totally fine with that. You can contact us and be able to take that as well. So you can email for more information at, admin@integratedmedicineacademy.com. Okay, so there is my practice website, mysunrisecenter.com, and then phone number and email. So I do also involved in clinical practice as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Woeller, and sharing your knowledge with us. We do have several questions in the chat.
Okay.
I'd like to jump into those if you are good to go. Our first question is, I thought that folic acid was bad and only folate was good. Please elaborate on that.
So folic acid is a synthetic developed version of of folate. So I don't remember all of the reasons why folic acid was developed. I think it's more stable in food. So they've added it. And also, I think the other reason too is it has really good absorption. So it tends to have high absorption. So it tends to get added to a lot of food, primarily to avoid birth defects in women who are pregnant. So that was the main reason behind it. So it's not that it's bad, it's just a different form. In order to get folic acid to become what's called active folate, it has to go through a series of enzymatic steps. So all of these things tend to get converted from one form to the next. So folic acid, I can't remember how many enzymes reactions it has to go through, like three or four, maybe four or five. So there's a lot of chemistry that has to happen in between that. The other downside to just folic acid is there's research that it may or likely interferes with the main folate receptor that brings in natural folate into the brain. So what's happening in the discussion of leucovorin and folate? So let's break it down into three different forms. You have folic acid, you have folinic acid, and you have methylfolate. So in the context of what the conversation we just had, methylfolate is the form that actually supports the methylation cycle in converting homocysteine to methionine because it's actually involved in donating a methyl group to methyl-B12 in order for that reaction to happen. So it's actually closest to methylation support than all of the other, folate type of supplements. So we have folic acid. It has to go through a number of different steps to actually get to folate. Then we have folinic acid. Well, folinic acid actually enters the folate cycle above MTHFR. So everybody focuses on MTHFR for good reason, because MTHFR is what helps make methylfolate. We can get methylfolate in our diet, or we can make it intrinsically. So folic acid would have to go through multiple steps, eventually get converted by MTHFR into methylfolate. But you can have blocks along the way. Folinic acid enters a little bit further down on that pathway. It enters above MTHFR, but it's closer to being converted into methylfolate. So it still has to go through the MTHFR in order to get there. Why folic acid is not being used is because, again, there's research that it interferes with the main folate receptor that's drawing natural folate into the brain. So it's a really simple analogy, but imagine our brain is our home, and we have to get folates of various forms into our brain in order for them to do what they need to do in our brain. Okay, support cognitive ability and language, etc. Well, imagine we only have two doorways to allow that to happen. Forget about the garage and the garage door. So basically, your home has a front door and a back door. So the front door is the main folate receptor. That's what's drawing folate into the brain from the bloodstream. The FRAT test, which is called the folate receptor antibody test, is measuring an immune reaction to the main folate receptor. Essentially, it's measuring an immune reaction to the front door. And if you actually do that test, there's two antibodies. You have what's called blocking and binding. Well, the blocking antibody blocks the door. So now you can't get anything to bind or even open the door. The binding antibody, it depends on where it binds, but it either binds to the door, maybe kind of around the door jamb or somewhere near the door, but it affects the way the door opens and functions. Either way, the ability to get natural folate into the brain is compromised because it can't get through the front door. Folinic acid, or leucovorin, that slightly different form, enters the brain through the back door. Okay, but the main folate doesn't go through the back door. It can only go through the front door. So and at least we know we're not forming an immune reaction to the back door. So that's essentially why the leucovorin is being used, is it's bypassing the front door and getting into the brain through the back door. So again, they're all different forms that have to be converted and support each other just through different enzymatic reactions, but there's specific reasons why they're used. But the big one and the main reason to avoid folic acid in the context of autism discussion is that it appears to be interfering with the front door. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes. Yes. Can you discuss the benefits or limitations of stool, urine, blood, and heavy and hair heavy metal testing?
That's a great question. They all have
Mhm.
limitations. Um, there is no one perfect heavy metal test. And I mean, I've dealt with this for years in practice and thought about this. I've lectured to this. There's just not one perfect test. All of these tests are tests of detection, or excuse me, test of exposure. So let's start with stool. I personally never use a stool test. Okay, because by and large, the stool is a reflection of what you've recently eaten or consumed through liquid. Okay, so really what you're getting on a stool test perhaps is just something environmentally. It doesn't really speak to anything that you've absorbed necessarily. At least we don't know. So that's not something I do that often. A hair analysis is a reflection of exposure over time, at least a few months, because every hair follicle has a capillary that's flowing by it. So anything that makes its way into the bloodstream and is circulating all throughout the body will pass by a hair follicle. And the hair follicle can, it's tapped into the same blood system because it needs the same nutrients that our other organ systems in the body needs. And so if there's metals present, it has the ability to kind of suck up those metals as well. Is it perfect? No, because it doesn't tell us how much heavy metal is in the body. It's just a representation of exposure over time. But there are good studies that have been done over the years in looking at hair as a reflection of what may be accumulating in other organ systems. There's actually a paper out of Poland. They did this years ago. They looked at hair and they looked at different organs. These are people that had died. There was organ systems. I can't remember. It was like the liver, the kidney, whatever it was. A blood test is a decent way of testing, but it's usually for, recent acute exposure because most metals aren't going to stay in circulation in the bloodstream for very long. They're either going to be passed out in the urine or they're going to settle out of the blood into a tissue somewhere. So unless you have ongoing high exposure, a blood test isn't going to tell us a whole lot. Now, they still can be beneficial. We know there's communities around the US right now that are getting lead in their water supply. And if you do a lead test, their blood levels will likely be elevated because they're continually consuming it. And then there was the urine tests. So urine test is tricky. It's a good way of assessing things, but it has its limitations. Most of the time, if you do a urine test without any provocative medication, that would be things like DMSA or DMPS, you generally aren't going to see a lot. I'm just saying sort of an average of most people. Unless there is high level of exposure happening acutely to where the blood levels would be high enough for it to spill into the urine and come out in the urine. So the urine test is a reflection of exposure, but it's typically not a reflection as just a baseline test of long-term exposure in the past, unless that exposure is continuing today or of recent. Where urine testing is, I feel, and have found most beneficial, is where you do pre and post collection. So what that means is that you do, let's say for example, if I were to do a test on myself, I'd go to bed, I'd get up, I'd have my first morning urine, and I'd collect urine from my first morning without having taken a chelating agent or what's called a provocative agent. So I've got my first morning urine just by itself. Then I take a chelator. So I take a large dose of DMSA or DMPS, or maybe I go to the doctor's office, I get an IV infusion of one of those two compounds, and then I measure my urine throughout the day for another 8 hours. I send them off to the lab, and now I get both results back. One is prior to the provocative agent, one is afterwards. And there will most of the time be a major difference. And that has been the gold standard way, essentially, of trying to determine body burden of heavy metals over time. And then if you get that benchmark, then you take your chelating agent. The next time you come in, you sort of repeat the urine test and see if the levels are dropping. But even that doesn't tell you how much heavy metal is actually stored in the body. It doesn't tell us how much is actually in the brain or the nervous system somewhere else. It's telling you what's coming out by having been induced by a chelating agent, but it doesn't tell us how much is left behind. So we don't always know how much is left behind in any of these particular tests. And in reality, living on planet Earth and the environments that we live in and the things that we're surrounded by, the chances of us being 100% devoid of any heavy metal is, I think, highly unrealistic. There's going to be likely some of it there to some level. But most of us, from a biological and a biochemical standpoint, can buffer against it or have enough other systems in play or neutralize where these things aren't a problem, ideally, at very, very low levels. So I hope that it's a complicated discussion and it's a great question. All of them have value. Personally, I don't do the stool test. I start with the hair analysis as a way of initial assessment. I may move to the urine testing if we want to do challenge testing, depending on the child. I will tell you that, urine challenge testing can be sometimes troublesome. There's some steps that have to be involved with it. It's not impossible to do, but it has some logistical steps that can be challenging in some cases. So the hair test is a good representation of exposure. The blood testing, I will do if I can do blood testing, but I'm sure many of the parents on here know that doing blood testing for many individuals is often challenging. It's worthwhile to try to do it. It's certainly difficult to do in repeated cases over time.
Okay, thank you. Does leucovorin have to come from a compounding pharmacy?
It does not, in my experience, in my opinion. So here's the thing about leucovorin. I don't remember, I'd have to look it up, who was the original pharmaceutical company that coined it leucovorin. Leucovorin is typically what is attributed to prescription level folinic acid. So folinic acid is leucovorin. You can get folinic acid in more of a standard supplement dose. So for example, Seeking Health is one company. There's many companies that have folinic acid. They have an 800 microgram tablet or capsule of folinic acid. You could call it leucovorin. Okay. If you actually go to PubChem, a website, and you type in folinic acid, it'll take you to the leucovorin page. If you type in leucovorin, it'll take you to the same page. Okay. Because they're synonyms of each other. They're calcium folinate, essentially, is what it is. New Beginnings Nutritionals carries a product called high folinic. It's 15 milligrams of folinic acid. Now, that could also be called leucovorin. The prescription form of leucovorin starts at 5 milligrams. So I think they have 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams, 25 milligrams. There might be a 15 milligram tablet now. I have to look, but 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams. So 25 and 50. So, but if you actually look at the ingredient, they're all calcium folinate. So you can actually get leucovorin now in supplement form without a prescription. You can do so through New Beginnings Nutritionals. The reason the compounding pharmacies are often used is that the prescription forms of leucovorin, like from, wherever you go to Walgreens or Costco or Walmart. I don't know, does Walmart have a pharmacy? CVS. You're just getting kind of standard leucovorin. A lot of times they have added fillers and coloring and sometimes those things that kids react negatively to. But again, the base chemical is still calcium folinate. It's just all the other stuff in it. I know that there's been some discussion of what's called different isomers of folinic acid. But by and large, the compounding pharmacies are just providing the more clean source without any of the additive colors and flavorings to it. So some of the kids do fine with just prescription leucovorin. Some who react negatively, where they get agitated or irritable, kind of similar to kids who might react to artificial colorings or flavorings. It's probably more that than it is actually the folinic acid inside. So there's more options now than there used to be. Um, my preference, if we are doing I'm going to call it prescriptive folinic acid. That's leucovorin essentially, the way it is being termed now. Then I will, tend to run it through a compounding pharmacy. But I've had good success with the folinic acid that New Beginnings provides. And again, they provide it as a 15 milligram capsule, which is pretty nice. There's a few other supplement companies out there. I can't remember. I don't think it's Jim Adams' company, but there's one other company that I came across that had higher dose folinic acid. I think it was 5 milligrams in a capsule of folinic acid. For years, and actually in that Jill James paper, they were using 800 micrograms of folinic acid at that time. That was back in 2004. So the use of the higher dose folinic acid or leucovorin is relatively recent. There was a paper by Rosendahl, I think, came out probably 10 years ago in talking about leucovorin, whereas being dosed higher. So, but no, it does not have to automatically come from a compounding pharmacy.
Okay, and I think this question kind of piggybacks off that question. Um, I gave my son 25 milligrams of leucovorin and he started lapping in a disruptive way, and I had to stop after 1 month. I thought maybe he had enough folate. Any thoughts? He has a lot of heavy metals that have reduced with detox.
Yeah, I would just say it's too high a dose too soon. So think of these B vitamins. The same would be true of B12. The same would be true of B9, by the way. B9, vitamin B9 is folate. So folinic acid, leucovorin fits in that category, that bucket. B6. Think of these like light switches. I mean, they basically ignite chemistry. And in some kids, when you turn on a light switch here or there, it gets enough illumination to where all of a sudden they're more connected. They're more, eye contact or awareness. And that's great. Others, you turn on a few light switches and the room gets too bright too quick. Okay, their brain is just not quite ready yet. So it's always best, in my experience, to start low and start slow and build up slowly over time. I think in that particular case, most likely it's just too many light switches getting flipped too quickly for your child. So I wouldn't give up on the leucovorin. I personally, what I do is you went off of it anyway, is I would go back and start it at a much slower level. I don't know in that case if the doctor gave a 25 milligram, if they can go back to, but I would honestly go back to even a 5 and start there, and just kind of ramp it up slowly. So that could be so I've had some kids where you can ramp it up every 48 to 72 hours. Others, it's taken them 2 weeks. So you just have to be patient. And if there's been improvement with metals, then you might want to look at some other chemical exposures and things if there's anything else in play. If you've not done organic acid testing, I'd recommend that because again, the fungal compounds, probably other microbial compounds could interfere with these systems as well. So it kind of goes back to working on digestive function too. But I don't give up on the leucovorin. I think it's just too much too soon.
Mm, okay. Do you recommend supplementing with glutathione as well?
Not always. I mean, this presentation makes it sound as though that would always be a good idea. By and large, glutathione is a very important supplement to use. It's oftentimes kids are deficient in glutathione because of various reasons, environmental exposures. Um, it's not an automatic. First off, I want to do testing to kind of see where our exposure levels are. There's a marker on the organic acid test that helps evaluate for glutathione status. I also want to get an idea how well a child is tolerating other supplements. Anytime you add glutathione, you will be inducing a detoxification effect. So it's a great supplement, but it's not an automatic in every circumstance.
Okay. Um, should you continue to see improvements the longer you take methyl B12, or at some point does it plateau?
Great question. There's always a plateauing effect that I've seen over the years with a wide variety of treatments, that whether it's diet, whether it's just a group of supplements, or there always seems to be a plateau, this perception of a plateau. And I mean, to me, I think that's kind of expected. Maybe, maybe we're not getting a plateau, but the the escalation of improvements maybe just slowing down. I kind of think of it like an airplane. You get this dramatic takeoff and incline, right? So it's very dramatic at first, and then over time the plane starts to level out. It gains its sort of cruising altitude, but it's still progressing forward in a forward motion. So you're still making ground. So the reality is none of us know what will happen when we stop a treatment. The only way to know if you need to continue with something is do you actually stop it and see if there's a decline. And that would be true of leucovorin, that would be true of B12 or other types of things. Usually, if there's a decline, for example, in benefits, it's seen relatively quickly, maybe within the first week or two. It's like, you know what? Jimmy over there is just not connecting like he used to. I mean, the one variable we did was took the methyl B12 out. And then I've had kids where we took them off after, whether a year or 2 years, and they were fine. They just continued to progress, and they sort of maybe got past the dependency on the methyl B12, for example. I had one case where this actually happened twice with the same case. There was a kid that, again, we probably reached a plateau. The parents were like wanting to step away from the B12 because it was just kind of a pain to do after so long. And the child was getting older and he was involved in more sports and that kind of stuff. And so I'm like, that's fine. So we went off. And it wasn't until about 90 days out that the parent says, he's just not connected like he was. Just some things were starting to return. Initiated the B12 again. Those things went away and he kind of started cruising along. Tried it again, maybe 6 months later. Same thing kind of happened. So there are some things where you might be able to convert it over to more of an oral form or a nasal spray form, depending on the age of the child or their tolerance. So, again, though, there is that aspect of the plateauing. And again, you won't always know until you stop something. But I look at these things too, is that in most of the cases, when it comes to these B vitamins, and it would be true of methyl B12, we're not looking necessarily at a deficiency of B12 by and large. The same would be true even of folate or B6, for example. But particularly true of B12. You can generally overcome a dramatic nutritional deficiency of a B vitamin relatively quickly. What we're looking at in most cases, and this would certainly be true of B12, is just a biochemical dependency on that specific form of B12 to continue to aid in the methylation reaction of homocysteine and methionine. And what we hope for and what we do see is that biochemical dependency becomes less and less as time rolls on, as there's less toxins, as there's more integration of the folate methylation transsulfuration pathway or other factors, where they just don't become as dependent on it.
Okay. Julian, who is an active member in our autistic community, says, I was told that I had an issue with my sulfate pathway and to avoid methylated vitamins causing irritation. Would I still be a candidate for the MB shots and folate question?
Maybe the one of the things that will happen with methyl B12 is it can push the transsulfuration pathway. So what what happens that particular circumstance is, remember in that Jill James paper, what they found, one of the things that changed was the glutathione pattern in those kids. They started to see an increase in reduced glutathione versus oxidized glutathione. So glutathione is a compound that we produce in two different forms. In the reduced form, it's active, meaning it actually is involved in its chemical reaction. After it's involved in its chemical reaction, it gets converted into something called oxidized glutathione, which means it needs to be reconverted back to its reduced form. So just think of it as active, inactive. So in many of the autistic kids, what they found was that there was higher levels of inactive glutathione, but when they gave the Methyl-B12, all of a sudden they had an increase in their active form of B12. So what was going on? So likely what was happening is that when you give Methyl-B12, you're converting homocysteine to methionine. Well, methionine then has to cycle back to become homocysteine again. And so if you think of this reaction like a clock face, so we got methionine at 12 o'clock, homocysteine at 6 o'clock. Well, in order to go from 12 o'clock down to 6 o'clock, you have to go on sort of the back end of the clock face. That's sometimes what I call the back end of methylation. The first thing to get produced is a chemical called SAMe, so S-adenosylmethionine. SAMe is the major methyl donor in our body. So we should be producing a lot of SAMe for it to be able to methylate a bunch of different stuff to help support DNA methylation, neurotransmitters, etc. And then from there, it has to get converted back down to homocysteine. And there could be a few blocks along the way. Well, it turns out that SAMe, when it's increased, is a light switch for that transsulfuration pathway because it actually activates an enzyme that starts to convert homocysteine down into the glutathione pathways. So if we got somebody that maybe has some genetic variants in their sulfate transsulfuration pathway, I don't know where it would be per se, methylation may sort of indirectly kind of stimulate that, where somebody might just be sensitive and reactive. So, I mean, that would have to be sort of fleshed out. You have to look at the genetics and other factors. But by and large, that's likely the mechanism that's happening, and that's likely the mechanism what was going on in that Jill James paper when they initiated Methyl-B12.
Okay. I was giving my son L-methylfolate. It seemed to make him tired and a little depressed. I would appreciate your thoughts on this. Thank you.
So, I thought about this, and this gets complicated, but what may be happening in a circumstance like that is there's something called the folate trap, and there can be different traps that occur biochemically. But one of the big ones in that particular circumstance is I'd be concerned about what's actually happening genetically within the methionine synthase. And the thing to think about methionine synthase is it's a complicated reaction chemically. And you can have some genetic effects and genetic influence over it. But again, we also know that it's vulnerable to environmental toxins. And that environmental toxicity component monkeys around with the cobalamin element that's part of that enzyme. And it has to do with its electrical state. And essentially, when the enzyme is reacting appropriately, it's reacting with methylfolate, for example, and you're getting transfer of the methyl group to homocysteine to convert to methionine. That cobalamin is moving from one electrical state to the next. And if it stays there and gets flipped back to the correct electrical state, then we're fine. The enzyme reset. But there's another electrical state that can occur in the presence of heavy metals, in the presence of chemical toxins, in the presence of acetaldehyde, in the presence of a lot of things that generate oxidative stress. That thing can flip to another electrical state that now stuck, and it causes the enzyme to just malfunction or wobble, essentially. It's all of a sudden it's not efficient. And it has to be brought back to the proper electrical state. But the problem is if you got something that's sitting there impacting it negatively, it can't do it really well. And that's kind of my sense of what may be happening in that particular case. An interesting aspect to this is that SAMe, that chemical that gets produced on the back end of methylation, is one of the things that tries to help rescue the methionine synthase when it's stuck. But if you have a problem in methylation overall and you're not getting enough SAMe production or something else is impeding it from occurring, now all of a sudden it can't really assist. So I don't know if it's really so much an issue per se of the L-methylfolate. It just may be something intrinsically happening within that relationship of the methionine synthase. The fatigue level probably comes about because we're not getting adequate mitochondrial support because of it. Or there's some other pressure point that's maybe happening in some of the related chemistry. Kind of difficult to say. The other thing is, well, this maybe gets a little bit too off in the weeds. I'm starting to just sort of conceptualize and think about potentially other reactions, but I'm curious in that particular case if they've actually tried folinic acid, or had just, did they say B12 or just L-methylfolate? Was it just
They
B12?
said L-methylfolate.
Yeah. Might try actually methyl B12. If you can do the methyl B12 injections, that would be good. But because one of the things that the methyl B12 does is it's like a jump gap, if you will, kind of over the methionine synthase problems to some degree. So that might be the best way to go forward in that circumstance, is to try methyl B12 and put the L-methylfolate, aside for a period of time.
Okay. I just checked my son's multivitamin, which is part of his Mito cocktail, and B6 is only 1 milligram. You stated the importance of B6 at the start of this presentation. Is it important to get that level up before starting the B12 injections?
Not necessarily. If you have some foundational nutrients in play, I mean, that can be helpful. The most multivitamins, they tend to have lower amounts. The higher dose B6 regimen actually came out of the work of Dr. Bernard Rimland from the Autism Research Institute many, many years ago. I think even going back into the 70s or 70s was some of his research that he was looking at. And they typically are dosing B6 anywhere between 4 to 8 milligrams per pound per day with half the amount of magnesium. Just like B12, just like folinic acid, I would never start at an 8 milligrams per pound dose. And again, understand that it's a large spectrum. It's not a one size fits all, approach. The studies that Jim Adams did in that paper from the Autism Research Institute show that at that time, I think there was 20 studies that had been looked at as far as favorable outcomes of vitamin B6 at higher dosages. It's something that would have to be tried to see if it complements a particular child. But in my experience, when it comes to the methyl B12 injections, it's not, you don't automatically have to have a child on high doses of B6 like that in order to see benefits from the methyl B12. In more cases than not, being on a multivitamin like her child is often beneficial. I don't know who the B12 is coming from, but excuse me, the multivitamin is coming from. You can make the case that maybe B6 could be a little higher, 5, 10 milligrams, maybe 20 milligrams, but it's not an all determining factor of whether the methyl B12 will be helpful or not. What I
Okay.
wanted to do is I wanted to show people that we tend to get caught up in the language of what's new. A lot of people focus on what's the new thing. and often gets forgotten about is what came before, and that there are these innovative treatments that have been around for decades, but no one talks about them anymore. In fact, when I gave my proposal to MAPS about this talk, uh, they're like, fantastic, it's great because you hardly ever hear about methyl B12 anymore.
Mm,
So that's why I did it, was I wanted to go back in time. In fact, I actually had a couple doctors come up to me after the lecture. One of them reached out to me. They had watched it online and they're like, oh my God, thank you for doing that. This is because, again, the hyper focus tends to get on what's the new thing. And again, we forget our history sometimes.
right. What is the ideal homocysteine blood level for children with autism?
Oh, probably, yeah, that tends to get bantered around. Um, Probably between 6 to 9. If you could get like a 7, between a 6 and 7 as a sweet spot, that would probably be for everybody, honestly. I just did my homocysteine, it was 10. 2 years ago it was 13. So I'm trying to get it down to about 7 or 8, but around that. So less than 5, you start to think it's not high enough. Over the reference range from the labs are a lot broader. But again, between 6 to 9, I think would be around 6 to 7, ideally, would be a good spot to have it.
Okay. What can I do to restore my son's brain function? He regressed at 3 with C. diff and at 4 with cresol and heavy metals. I have worked on all of these areas, but his brain function is no longer the same.
Well, I mean, that's a pretty broad discussion. I mean, this would be a discussion really, you'd have to have through a consultation to go back through clinical history and what the exposures were. And they mentioned some of them, things that have been tried in the past. I think you've done everything correctly as far as, you know, if there was a regression after C. diff. I think they also mentioned some other microbial compounds. So
Mm-hmm.
I would, personally, I would be looking to do some things like leucovorin and doing some things like methyl B12 to see if they could be helpful. It will require, some implementation and some strategy moving forward. There's some additional testing you can do from a genomics level to look at some of the genetic sequences that affect these systems. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy can often be very helpful for kids who've had regressive patterns. There may just be some blunted metabolic activity at the mitochondrial level that could also be explored. The hyperbaric oxygen therapy is something that has been used for years and is pretty well researched in the autism world, showing benefits not only from an improved metabolic efficiency and oxygenation levels to the brain, but decreases in inflammation. Again, it's one of those things that tends to get overlooked anymore. It's kind of often forgotten. And so I would say hyperbaric oxygen therapy would be a really good choice to consider in a child like that.
Yes. My son loves the hyperbaric oxygen. Um, okay, I think somebody wants your thoughts on this. Oligoscans are pretty great for heavy metal and mineral testing, in tissue. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't have much experience with those,
Okay.
but I think they're the oligoscans is what they are.
Oligoscans, okay.
Yeah. I'm not that familiar.
Okay.
So maybe.
Okay, and we have people saying thank you and that they're looking forward to taking your advice. I'm seeing maybe some other questions in the chat. What is your favorite detox? We have the ion cleanse, which I know you have supported. We also have a good zeolite as well as biosyndin. Just needed to know what to use as a binder for these two oral detoxes.
Well, I think it comes down to what you're trying to detox. Um, my favorite, the ion cleanse is great from a major difference. I think overall that's, helpful from a detoxification standpoint. It's gentle. I think you're also getting some autonomic nervous system influence where we're decreasing that fight or flight response. That's happening with kids. So it starts to help settle down their nervous system. Um, Adequate sleep, good consistent sleep over time is very important for brain detox. It primarily activates something called the glymphatics, which is actually the lymphatic system of the brain. So that's a little bit kind of somewhat indirect. But I would say from an overall detoxification standpoint, when I think about it, when you think about metal exposure, aluminum would be part of that, chemical exposure, mycotoxin exposure, whatever, just world exposures. Probably one of the best ways of detoxing is sweating. And so sauna therapy on a consistent basis can be extremely valuable. It's been shown to help get rid of aluminum. It's been shown to help get rid of certain mycotoxins, a wide variety of chemicals. And it is one of the most effective ways of detoxing the body. And then, exercise and sweating that way as well. So if I had to pick one way to detox, it would be sauna. As far as binders go, as a general binder, I mean, fiber has binding capacity. So flaxseed, ground up flax seeds are certainly a fiber source, but fiber can have a binding influence. But as far as like an overall good binder, I like the GI detox, which actually comes from biobotanical research. So it's got some fulvic acid, humic acid in it. It's got some activated charcoal. It's got some zeolite in it. A few of the chemicals I'm forgetting. So I kind of consider that to just be a good overall general binder. There is a binder from Quicksilver Scientific, and I'm blanking on the name right now. It's similar to the GI detox. I know this doesn't help anybody because I can't remember the name. But it's a fine powder, so a lot of little kids can take it, and so it mixes well in liquids. Trying to think if there's any others that I've used. I mostly have used the GI Detox. New Beginnings Nutritionals carries it. And so it's generally, I mean, overall pretty good.
Okay. My 27-year-old vaccine injured son with profound regressive autism and ITP has MTHFR and COMPT. He lives in a group home, which makes supplementing challenging. I was able to get methylated multivitamins, Methyl-B complex, and L-methylfolate. I stopped all three recently to take the FRAT test, which was positive. I'm hoping to start getting him Methyl-B12 injections and want to get all three back on board. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so the MTHFR, pretty common. If you have a heterozygous mutation on MTHFR, it's going to affect the function of the enzyme by about 30%, 40%. A homozygous, you're probably looking at about 60, 70%-ish compromised function. So it's still functional, it's just less efficient. Keep in mind that MTHFR is dependent on riboflavin, which is vitamin B2, as a cofactor. So, a good multivitamin that's got some B2 in it could be supportive or is supportive. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank. They also had a COMT and there was something else.
He just recently tested positive for,
The frat.
let's see. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, binding or blocking, if
Mm.
they can jump in. So either one is problematic, right? Because again, think of the main folate receptor as the front door. If you block it, okay, well, you can't get in. If you bind to it and mess with its ability to open, you're still compromising the ability to get in. It might open a little bit, but it's not efficient. So either one is indicating the use of leucovorin is warranted in those particular cases because you're trying to go through the back door. That's the idea. So the concept. And so it may be that may be an easier way to approach this. The methyl-B12 would make sense based on vaccine-induced regression. So 20, I think you said 27, right? So probably at that point was a vaccine that contained thimerosal. We know that mercury is a target for the methionine synthase. You'd have to go back through his vaccine records and look at aluminum-based vaccines, but that's probably also a component too. Either way, you're getting some effects, adverse effects on that methionine synthase. So methyl-B12 could certainly be helpful. I would do it through Hopewell. So both would definitely be, I think, a potentially beneficial thing. We'd have to just kind of have to eat. What I would recommend is that in that you're not starting leucovorin and methyl-B12 at the same time. So it's going to be an either or. And I don't know how her son was doing on methylfolate. I don't remember what that, but I would, in those particular circumstances, I would tend to be more of a fan of just having some supportive nutrients in play, like a multivitamin, for example, if tolerated, so that not pushing pathways too much. I don't know how sensitive he is. It really comes down to individual sensitivity and whatnot. But I would tend to be more inclined to use the methyl-B12 first from Hopewell Pharmacy and what I know about it and experience it because it's been around a lot longer. There's a lot more patients out there who've gone through methyl-B12 subcutaneous injections than there has been with leucovorin. Plus, the Hopewell version also has this other antioxidant influence. So that has that added benefit. I'd get started with that first for the first 6 weeks and then start to increase or add in the leucovorin thereafter.
Okay.
Kind of a difficult one because it's, these are making sort of general statements. And what I'm trying to pull from is just my experience having worked with so many people over the years, kind of similar circumstances, but it's never going to be exact because he's unique to himself. What I will
Right.
say in my experience is, I don't know, maybe this mom has figured it out with the facility that he's living in, is that the facilities are usually often resistant,
Mm.
to helping. So unless she's going in and doing the shot, unless she's going in and giving the leucovorin, whatever, maybe that's the case. And if so, fantastic. But trying to get assistance from a nurse or these facilities, they usually are not interested or hands off. They're hands off. So I don't know.
Yes. I know it's been a struggle for her. Um, how do you treat candida? We have used nystatin several times to not much effect.
Yeah, that's a challenging one. So here's the other thing to understand about fungus is these candida is a type of fungus. They have their own ability to thrive and survive. They're very evolved organisms. They're very sophisticated in what they can do. So they don't always easily go away. What I would say is I would start looking at other factors, meaning, are there other pathogens that might be also in the microbiome? Do we have just a lot of disruption in the gut from a microbiome standpoint, food reactions, etc.? What kind of chemicals perhaps are we being exposed to? Glyphosate is a great disruptor of the microbiome. Although it can be challenging to get away from glyphosate, you can do it fairly successfully by eating organic and non-GMO foods. Glyphosate will tip the scales to allow for more pathogenic organisms to take hold. The immune system also plays a role in controlling candida. So New Beginnings Nutritionals, this is where I'd actually tell this parent to actually reach out to New Beginnings and talk to Lori Knowles, or at least email Lori Knowles. There's some particular supplements like IgG powder, which can also have a nice bolstering influence for the mucosal immune system against candida. From a medication standpoint, if you're not getting success with nystatin, I think a trial of diflucan is worthwhile. So even a couple of weeks to see if a child responds to the diflucan. The other thing to keep in mind about these fungal organisms is the presence of mold. So sometimes we can get exposed to mold environmentally. The Aspergillus mold can, whether it colonizes the digestive system in its classic sense, or we're just getting some overgrowth pattern, that can also compromise the microbiome and the microbial immune system in the gut. So there's some other work to do for sure, but I kind of think of this type of thing in many regards similar to our discussion on the methylation cycle. If we're not getting good response to folate support, methylation support, what else is interfering? And you have to always ask the question, what else may be going on that's causing some type of interference on these systems? In this particular case with Candida, you have the organism itself, which is sophisticated in its desire to thrive and survive. But then you have these other influences, the gut, the immune system, etc., which also can influence it. So you have to start looking there. But in that case, by the way, I wouldn't hesitate if possible to just try,
Mm,
some diflucan to say, will the diflucan make a difference? Now, I don't know in this circumstance if it's, well, we tried nystatin and nothing happened, or we tried nystatin, it helped, but when we go away from nystatin, the yeast comes back. I don't know what the scenario is.
mm,
So, if you've tried nystatin and nothing helped, well, then you need to try something else. If you tried nystatin and it helped, you go off of it and it comes right back. Well, now you got other things that are influencing the immune system in the gut. You kind of have to you have to start looking deeper at the reasons why.
right. Krista did hop in and answered your question. She said the frat test was positive for binding, negative for blocking.
Okay.
I cannot get the group home to use Hopewell. I'm going to have to take him to a functional medical doctor for the B12 shots.
I'm wondering I'm wondering if she's going to be administering it.
Mm,
Because
yeah.
yeah. My experience in those kind of circumstances is that they just don't, um, unless there's a nurse that's very familiar, or there's a specific doctor who's writing a note and they're willing to do it, then you might get some assistance. But if it's not something, because a lot of times those facilities actually have an in-house doctor that comes and checks on things, so they, can oversee medications and whatnot. These are just sort of outside their usual um, levels of comfort. So
Mm. Let's see. She said, how often should he get it? Can I give it to him weekly when I see him?
ideally every 3 days, ideally.
Okay. Okay.
So I don't remember when there was this switch to going every 3 days. So take it back to that Jill James paper. That was in 2004. James Newbrander was actually an author on that paper. So when I started using Methyl-B12 injections, he was advocating to doing it every 72 hours. But if you remember in that paper, they implemented it twice a week. He advocated for 64.5 micrograms per kilogram dose. They were using, and that was every 3 days. They were using 75 micrograms per kilogram twice a week. So I don't remember, it's been a long time when sort of he shifted over to doing it every 72 hours. Um, it was probably sometime after that 2004 paper, whenever it was. So in this particular circumstance with this parent, you could just try to do it twice a week and dose it at 75 micrograms. I mean, that has been done before, and that was done in that research paper. So that would certainly be a reasonable thing to consider. As far as doing it just once a week, I think you're just going to lose the benefits. Try to
Okay.
minimally do it twice a week.
Okay. She said, can I just order it from Hopewell myself and then administer it like you're
You can't.
suggesting?
It's going to require a prescription.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And it actually, I wonder anymore. I don't know. I mean, Hopewell can do things a lot, but I wonder if they even have it as part of their protocol anymore. You know, the twice a week dosing, and they're a compounding pharmacist, so they can figure it out. It's just, I'm just wondering if anybody's even doing that anymore.
hmm. Um, okay, so then you would say that best advice to reach out to Hopewell and see what's happening.
Yeah, no, they're going to still require a prescription
Right.
regardless. Um, but I'm sure that they can. I don't know if they were doing twice a week dosing of that at that, but they can do it. It's just that it's just has to be written specifically for that.
Right. Any
I
thoughts
to be
about
honest, just as we wrap it, I honestly don't know how many doctors, even at MAPS, for example, are actually doing methyl B12 injections anymore. There are some of the Tracy called me the old guard, you know. Um, I mean, there's certainly some out there, but I would say by and large, I don't know for sure, but not as many as there used to be. So that was one of
hmm,
my motivations to actually giving this talk, was to try to reinvigorate that conversation.
right. Well, we appreciate that. And I know that we have been on here for 2 hours, so I don't know if you have a hard stop or if you
I
can
do
keep
have a hard
answering.
stop. I do, yeah.
Totally understand. Thank you so much for answering all of these questions and giving us all your knowledge. We really appreciate you. And if you would like to watch this, we will have it posted on our website, autismhealth.com. Thank you, everyone, for spending your Saturday with us. We're so blessed. Thanks,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Woeller.
Take care. Thanks so much.
Have a great day.